prisoner went away. And the old man says to Ivan, what happened to the old man? The kiss glows in his heart, but the old man adheres to his idea. Well, I think we have here one of the more striking passages in all of literature in terms of insight into the human condition, into the whole question of freedom, and especially as it relates to authority, church, etc. And of course, as you see, the essence of it is that whole idea we are burdened to freedom, and how do we escape that? It's the Sartrean question. And the answer that comes back is that, well, from the side of the cardinal, yeah, it is too much for the average person. You can't expect the average person to deal with all these changes in the church, have to think for themselves now, have to decide what penance to do during Lent instead of telling them what to do on Good Friday or on the Fridays and how much to fast. Instead of telling everybody black and white, this is what you're supposed to do, it's too much to ask people to decide moral questions on their own. To figure out, for married couples to figure out what they're going to do in the bedroom. Oh, it's too much for people. You can't expect that even in the 20th century, even after the Second Vatican Council. A lot of Catholic people have to be told what to do. That becomes the answer of the cardinal. And of course, as Ivan's brother understands, he says, but the parable tricks us. He says, because really you make the Grand Inquisitor look bad, and the silent Jesus becomes the hero. And so there's an ambivalence about the parable that is quickly noted. And so we have another reading of the parable that says, by odd inference, we get by the irony of it all. We see the method of Jesus, which is really that of freedom. The essence of what Jesus was all about was to free up people, to get people to appropriate the faith on their own, to be able to call God Abba out of their own experience, to be able to build the kingdom using their own resources, to think for themselves, to make moral judgments and not be imprisoned in the law. And so it comes out something like this, I think, that indeed Christ has freed us. He's freed us, given us the truth which will set us free, called upon us to think for ourselves. And that becomes maybe the antidote, the only way. How can one accept the burden of freedom except knowing that somehow there is power and strength? As the Orthodox tradition insists, there's the Holy Spirit within us. Christ has left us, but he gives us the Holy Spirit in us. We're temples of that Spirit who will guide us and help us to make progress and in one way or another to make our decisions, not always knowing that we are right, but knowing, confident that that is the only way to maturity and adulthood, to try to do our best with it. Well, I'm going to suggest we take a 5-minute break here. The Russian Orthodox Church in those 2 decades of repression and underground church and so on. At least 30 million people baptized into the Orthodox faith, often at great price, during the Stalin repression and even later on during Khrushchev, it was not unknown for children being raised in religious families to be taken from the home. To read about the repression during the Stalinist era and afterwards, because Khrushchev seemed to be more down on religion, not down on it, but thinking he had to replace it even more than Stalin did. And so you had terrible things going on, but in the midst of that, over 30 million Baptists, at least, it probably, if that's what the Soviet officials think, well, it probably was a lot more people who weren't recording them in any way and so on. And as is commonly known now, Gorbachev himself has admitted that he was baptized as a youngster. So. Well, I want to go on with this here and try to look at some other figures and this passing over in the same way. And here, the problem that I'm sensing is not as clear to me as this burden of freedom, but it's something like this. How do we maintain an inner freedom in the world, we could make it real concrete, in the world of advertising? I mean, how do you keep from letting the slogans of the time and the common wisdom, so to speak, infiltrate your consciousness? Maybe it would be a way of saying, how do we avoid in the contemporary world false consciousness? Hegel, already in the 19th century, talked about false consciousness as what happens with that is that you drink in the messages of the culture. You drink in the symbols of the culture, and they begin to shape your imagination, and they form sort of a grid through which you look at the world. And if it is distorted, in which it always is in one way or another, if it's distorted, then you don't see reality whole. You don't see it truly. So the question becomes, are we aware of that? We recognize it? And what does one do to preserve that? Freedom, move towards a greater freedom where we would not simply be a victim of false consciousness. I think I sort of oversimplified the point, but maybe it'll stand and we get a feel for the question. Now, to help us deal with that, I want to pass over to Boris Pasternak, and another Russian novelist, 1890 to 1960. To locate him a little bit. So Dostoevsky, we're dealing with a 19th century figure, late 19th century. He wrote Brothers Karamazov, I think around 1880 or something like that. Pasternak, we're dealing with the 20th century figure, and Dr. Zhivago, his well-known work, which he published in the West, I think in the late 1950s, 57. Well, Pasternak was one who I think exemplified this ability to maintain an inner freedom vis-a-vis all the sloganeering, their subtle form of advertising in the Soviet world. Artists at that time were expected to toe the line and to produce works in the genre known as socialist realism, which meant fundamentally that the art or literature, whatever, was meant to promote the revolution, to promote socialist ideals. It had a political purpose. In other words, artists weren't free to create. They were functionaries of the state and were to try to further the revolution. Well, Pasternak refused to do that. He refused to do it even under Stalin. One of the great mysteries is why Stalin didn't have him wiped out like he had anybody else who even thought of opposing him wiped out, including his comrades and Trotsky himself, who was involved in the revolution, etc. I mean, it was nothing for him to purge out all the major figures in the party and sort of start over. Purge the generals, which weakened them for the Second World War. And yet, he didn't kill Pasternak. And there's a lot of theories, I mean, why that would be, but it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, because Pasternak refused to toe the party line, refused to write odes to Stalin, as one author has said, and hymns to socialism. And he kept his own integrity and spoke out in favor of greater artistic freedom and so on. And his big thing was you had to fight for reality. And that's sort of the common theme I was getting in talking to a lot of people and talking to Father Václav Milí in Prague. You must fight for the truth. Don't assume you have the truth. You've got to fight for it. It's a conquest almost. It's a struggle to keep your mind clear, to fight off false consciousness. Later on, if I ever get to this, I want to deal with Sakharov also, and there's a telling comments of Sakharov about Stalin and how his own mind was poisoned by Stalin. But to stay with Pasternak now, through his poetry and through his novel writing, the whole quest was to get at the reality, to get at the truth. And remind you of the movie Dr. Zhivago. In fact, I watched it the other night in sort of preparation for this to refix that in my mind, and I suppose a lot of people have seen it, but What I get out of some of the commentaries and some of Pasternak's own thoughts, this freedom theme is very great. Later on, after the book, in an interview, Pasternak said, this age is filled with new promise, and it's a promise of new freedom. And I think he saw a lot of that. It reminds you of one of the telling scenes in the movie along this line is when Zhivago and his wife and his little son and his father-in-law have to flee. This is after he comes back to Moscow, and his house is now where they had, 13 rooms or something, room for 13 people. It was all cut up, and the comrades are all living in there, and they have a little space and no firewood and so on. And he goes out and he steals the firewood, and his brother, who's a police officer, sees him, and his brother ends up warning him that he's got to get out of town. He's a doctor. He had served in the army. And this is back in the Revolutionary time, right? I mean, the setting is before the war, First World War, and then Zhivago goes and serves in the army, comes back to his wife and child, and when he gets back, his whole house is taken over by others, the comrades. The revolution has occurred. Lenin, the Bolsheviks are now in power. And this is what Pasternak, of course, was doing, was trying to help us get a feel for the revolution, what it was all about, the aristocracy beforehand, the new situation afterwards, the suffering, the civil war that occurred from 1917 to 1921, to try to get in tune with all of that. Well, so Zhivago's brother warns him, and he has to leave. And so already we're in a coercive situation of the worst kind, and now they're into this car, railroad car. And in that situation, it's terrible. And in the car, there's one fellow who is chained. And he is a forced labor. They got a quota of people to send off to the Ural Mountains where they're heading to do forced labor. And he's the quota. I mean, he's it, and he's there in chains. And while the communist bureaucrat comes into the car, they're all laying around in this car, crowded in and everything, and is telling them, do this and don't do this and follow these orders and all of this. And while he's doing that, this guy in chains is yelling at him, oh, you guys are out of it, and he's just criticizing him right and left while he's there in chains. Everyone else afraid to speak up. And then the fellow lying there says to the rest of the people, after the guy leaves, says, I'm the only one here who's really free. I'm the only one in this car. All the rest were free people at that time. He's in chains. I'm the only one here who's really free, he says. Shouts it out to them. Reminds me again of John Paul Sartre, who wrote so well on freedom, who said, telling statement, we were never so free as during the resistance, when France was occupied by the Nazis, and they were resisting, and he was in the resistance. He said, we were never so free as when we were in the resistance, under occupation. Now that begins to shake us. Well, what is this freedom he's on? What's this guy chained up like this? Can't move. He's the one free. Well, it's true to me that indeed dealing with freedom throughout the novel, and trying to tell us various things about what is going on. Now, to bring back to mind for some people the character of Pasha, and remember that Lara is the feminine figure in the movie and in the book, and Lara, commentators again, represents that feminine in the Russian thought. The woman, so often is there feeling in the Russian psyche that the women will free. The woman is the mother of Russia. The Germans are the father, but the mother. The mothers today who make all run, make society, it's practically a patriarchal society. And the mother would free. That idea of the virgin, remember I might have told you, but in the Russian legs of the Virgin Mary, she frees people. If surgical goes out and gets a certain souls between Easter and I think it is. Goes there and sees out if he's the seer figure. Lara, the movie, seen as that of seer figure. She marries Pasha, and Pasha is this Bolshevik and this great revolutionary. And he leaves Lara and goes off to do his thing of being the revolutionary. And they get the interchanges later on between Zhivago And this fellow, and representing the two poles here in this notion of what the political struggle is all about. And Strelnikov, Pasha takes on the name of Strelnikov. General Strelnikov represents this sloganeering. He's the guy who's got no feel for his wife anymore, no feel for human beings, wipe out human beings, kill people for the sake of the revolution. Who cares? That's what it's all about. Because of this abstract ideal, we're going to create the classless society. Strelnikov, as the movie goes on, eventually commits suicide when he's in the Alps with the Bolsheviks, for one reason or another, brought back and commits suicide before they can execute him. On the other hand, Zhivago, throughout, represents the person with the personal touch, the one whose freedom moves him to try to interact with people. And there's a scene where in the first, where the Bolsheviks are attacked by the Tsar's soldiers yet, where somebody's laying out there and Zhivago goes out and he wants to attend to them. And so, well, we'll take, let him go, get out of the street, we'll arrest you. He wants to attend to them, to fix that up. And I think that, I don't remember the exact words, but in one of the scenes when he's brought before Strelnikov, and the question is Strelnikov going to wipe out Zhivago or not? And he says something to him about, when he has forgotten Laura and his wife, I mean, he's nothing to him, it's all in the past, it's a revolution is all that counts. He says something about, how can you be like that? It's a bloodless way to live. Doesn't have any feeling. Well, I mean, you can go on with that, but it appears as though what Pasternak is doing throughout is contrasting this outlook and fighting for realism. And his contention is that you get real, not in your head abstractly or cerebrally, you get real by interacting with people. You get real by loving individuals, not loving the mass. And I so often said, it's nice to say, let's love everybody. Good, we'll love everybody. The problem is to love this person who's here, who gets on my nerves, rubs me the wrong way, who's abrasive. That's the real problem for the Christian outlook. And too often, what I think Pasternak saw and what, is important to see about this freedom business is that the cop-out, we love everybody, I love everybody, I don't have anything against anybody, becomes a way out of loving this person who's here and now. And it looks like Strelnikov, who's put in a bad light by Pasternak, represents this sort of communist ideal, we will sacrifice the individual for the state. I think I said this before, but one of the deputies that was at the talks that I gave in the Soviet Union told me how he was wrestling with this whole conflict between who's more important, the person or the state, and said that, as a result of that talk, that he really became convinced that it's the person who's important, and more important than the state. Well, that's the kind of thing they have to wrestle with over there. And they're fed a whole propaganda line that says, forget the individual, the dignity of the person in favor of this abstract ideal, this classless society, at least the way Pasternak saw the whole thing here. Well, there's a lot more that could be said about that novel or that movie that some people might know it through the movie. Maybe just to bring it back to our own situation here. I see it as a challenge from outside of our culture. In a sense, it's hard to realize the false consciousness we fall into. It's hard to be aware of how the signals that are coming from the culture, because it's all pervasive. It's all around us, the signals of what you're supposed to like and not like, wear and not wear, what standards of goodness and adulthood and beauty there are, always programmed for us. And of course the world of advertising has a large role in that. So what I see Pasternak sort of doing is saying, if you want inner freedom, you got to fight for it. You got to see through it. You got to be willing to criticize and think and not just drink in the signals from the culture. I've said it so many times that the first time I really felt that is when I was listening to Eugene McCarthy one time, and when he was running for president, and his line was something like this: if you listen to the ads on television, you'd become convinced that the oil companies are in the business to save wildlife. And that's, if you remember, is when the oil companies were running the ads about the drilling out in the ocean. And the whole thrust of it was, we're preserving the wildlife here. And I remember, for some reason, it just hit me. And it was the first time I understood false consciousness. And to cut through it, the importance of cutting through it. And how you're bombarded with a message like the Chinese are using the big lie now about Tiananmen Square. It's constantly bombarding the people with another big lie, total lie. And the communists have been good at that. And before long, it becomes just part and parcel of the way of thinking. That's why they write history in a certain way. So I'm saying, from Pasternak, it's like he's telling us, yeah, freedom is coming to birth, but only if you really struggle with it. And you have to fight the false consciousness, try to get back. And how you do that, it seems to me we're back to the message of Christ and something about the importance of the gospel and being a critique upon the culture in which we live. I'm never going to get through with all of this, which obviously is not terribly important, but I did have certain things I wanted to say. The other person, I had two more people I wanted to bounce off of here. One is Andrei Sakharov, and Sakharov tells me something else here, and this is the question of somehow not just Pasternak's inner freedom, because you remember for him, Zhivago was an ineffective intellectual. He's trained as a doctor, but he couldn't do a damn thing about straightening out anything, really. And so it's sort of represented in Pasternak's mind as the ineffective intellectual. Well, Sakharov represents another idea. That is, the person who does make a difference, who enters the social arena. Because one of the problems now I'm in touch with is that freedom can become privatized. Yeah, I'm going to keep my consciousness straight, fine, I'm going to, I'm free, I'm lucky, live in the United States and so on, but what does that mean politically? Does it mean translate into the public square, the public debate? Sakharov takes us into there. Sakharov, remind you, he was born 1921 and died just in December of 1989, the age of 68. Time magazine's running excerpts from his new book, his memoirs. It's coming out. Last two issues of Time, marvelous material. And most of what I have to say is, I think, taken from there. And so people have read it. I'll just summarize some major points that struck me. He talks about the Stalinist times, and his own father was afraid to speak to him about his attitudes towards Stalin. And Sakharov writes, this reluctance to reveal one's thoughts, even to one's own son, may be the most haunting sign of those times, of the Stalinist era. A father could not, in the privacy of his own home, tell his son what he thought about political matters. The most haunting sign of those terrible Stalinist times of repression, of a lack of freedom. When Stalin died in 1953, Sakharov wrote this, I am under the influence of a great man's death. I am thinking of his humanity. Andrei Sakharov, 1953, Stalin. He must explain this because he knew of Stalin's atrocities. So typical of the 50s, where intellectuals could not criticize the Soviet Union. And he says, here's what he says. He knew about his torture, arrest of innocent people, deliberate starvation, violence, all there. He said somewhere in his mind was the idea instilled by propaganda that suffering is inevitable during great historic upheavals. He felt committed to the goal he assumed was Stalin's, that after the devastating war, the country would be strong enough to ensure peace. He says about himself, he had the need to create an illusory world, probably like everybody else, to justify himself. He was working on the hydrogen bomb and all, father of the hydrogen bomb. The state, the nation, and the ideals of communism remained intact for him. It was years before he understood the deceit, exploitation, and fraud involved. And he goes on to say, he thought that the Soviet state was the prototype for all other countries to imitate. It's in the 50s. That's that ideal. You cannot understand the Soviet Union without understanding that Trotskyite ideal, that dream. 53 thought they were the vanguard of where we're supposed to go and how the state was going to work. So Stalin killed off a few million people in the process. And then he says, that shows the hypnotic power of mass ideology. These are the great people of the 20th century, the most brilliant men of our time, one of the most courageous, co-opted in that culture by the Stalinist line. Well, as we know, he moves out of that. He begins to see the light. In the 50s, he began to oppose the nuclear testing. He speaks out for human rights. I don't know that it's necessary to go through all of this. I suppose a lot of it really is known. In 1968, he finally breaks entirely with the party. He writes a very influential extended article, and in the beginning of it, he quotes Goethe's Faust with the epigraph at the beginning of the book, which says, "Of freedom and of life, he only is deserving who every day must conquer them anew." We're only deserving of freedom and life if every day we conquer them anew. This is what he wrote when he broke with the. He never did join the Communist Party. He was, he was a brilliant intellectual. He worked in a munitions factory during the war, and then he was on the thermonuclear things and developed hydrogen bomb and so on. Became then, after this, a great proponent of human rights. Spoke up, letters to Khrushchev. Khrushchev really didn't like him at all and said he was interfering. And then he says in 1968, when Moscow, when the Soviets invaded Prague, remember the Prague Spring, 1968, he said that was the death of it for many people. For many people, that finally destroyed the dream. The dream that the Soviet system and its great potential to be the vanguard of where the world ought to go. His first wife died in 1969. He married Elena Bonner. She was much in the news, remember, coming over to this country and everything. He had big arguments with Solzhenitsyn about where the reform. This might be sort of helpful to us because, it's always a question, where are the Soviets going to find their glue and where are they going to get their motivation and their framework to make progress with this horrible economic system? And of course, Sakharov being a scientist, it seems as though his predominant view was that it would be a humanistic type science that would lead the way and help us to know where to go. Solzhenitsyn didn't buy that. He thought the modern world was totally corrupt. Remember the famous talk at Harvard he gave, and the lambasting the Western world, and the United States is corrupt, democracy is out of it, and we got nothing but consumerism in this country, and so hedonism, and it's all run wild. Solzhenitsyn thought somehow we had to get back to that fundamental Russian Orthodox religion and its values. That seemed to split Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn on where's the glue. He saw it in the folks, in the peasants, in the serfs, in the traditional values. It almost sounds like the neoconservatives in the United States today about where you're going to find the thing that will keep the culture together. So Sakharov is very critical of Solzhenitsyn as sort of being out of touch and having these primitive ideas about how we're going to reform society. 1980, he was deprived of the state honors, exiled to Gorky, that's the city where the Western columnists and journalists couldn't come, couldn't see visitors and so on, and then wrote his memoirs, which were stolen by the KGB. He tells about writing, 1,000 pages, and he'd carry them with him all the time so no one would take them. Went to the dentist's office. The dentist made him put it aside, had to give him an injection or something. KGB picked it up. He lost his memoirs. Had to go back and start writing them all over again. I can just imagine finishing a manuscript. And there it is. And then it's gone. No backup on the computer. Unbelievable. And what does he do? Does he despair? Starts writing again. That's you get a feel for these Russians who rose above the system, and they're so strong and so courageous and so persevering. It's unbelievable. So he starts out again. On that occasion, he said 500 typewritten pages and 900 handwritten pages were taken. And then finally Gorbachev comes to power in 1985, and he's rehabilitated, comes back to Moscow and gets involved in the political life. And finally in 1989 then, he says we got to have another party, can't just rely on the Communist Party, makes a big talk along that line, comes home and dies of a heart attack, age 68, having been, it says here, a free man for less than 3 years and all of that. Well, so I'm seeing Sakharov is telling us one other thing about the whole quest for freedom, and that is that our freedom has to have a political, social dimension to it. That some or another, we ought to be effective, not just nice people. In a sense, it leads me to be sort of critical of the social justice purists. The sense that, I'm going to be pure. It's not so much whether we get it done or not. Sakharov represents another style. Maybe we need both kinds. I might be overstating it there. But part of my own feeling for social justice is that we've got to form collaborations. We've got to find coalitions where we can work together to get things done. In other words, it was nice in the Vietnam War, but to burn the flag and to feel pure in denouncing the war. But it always seemed to me what was called upon is to get people together to elect candidates who would be against the war and to draw other people in. There's a lot of research data that suggests the average middle-class American would naturally have been against the war for many reasons, but they couldn't bring themselves to identify with people who were going to burn the flag. I remember being in demonstrations back then when the big thing was dress up. Be dressed properly if you're going to be on television. You're going to be interviewed. Be dressed properly. I sold that idea. I was big on that. So as to make an impact, to draw people in instead of saying put people out. I'm not going to identify with those long-haired radicals. Well, Sakharov represents that other ideal of effective work on the behalf of justice. And my final person is Mikhail Gorbachev, who's taking more shots today, if you saw in the news, considered to be almost a Hamlet-like figure these days, Hamlet being an extremely important person in Russian intellectual thought in the last 2 centuries, and many articles written about him, and he's a great hero figure or questioning figure. But anyway, Gorbachev being accused of being vacillating now and so on, and not coming through with strong economic reforms, caving into the right wing, to the people who want to preserve the status quo and so on. But what Gorbachev has done is to prepare his own version of a religious liberty document. And I have in my hand something here that is not even circulated in the Soviet Union and will be debated in the their parliament, and it is a human document draft on the USSR law on freedom of conscience in the Soviet Union. And actually, it was given to some Americans. Harold Berman, who was a member of our delegation to Moscow, was given this to critique it. Gorbachev and his people wanted to see what Americans thought about their efforts to produce a religious liberty document for the Soviet Union. And but it's not public in Russia now, and it will be coming up. But the point of it is that Gorbachev understands that you have to have religious liberty as a basis for having freedom in the culture as a whole and for making the economic system work. That's where I see part of his brilliance. Gorbachev is a pragmatic man. He's not an intellectual. But he understands what is needed to turn their society around. He understands there's a spiritual dimension to it, there's a religious dimension, and religious freedom is important. Well, it's a long document, but it is quite remarkable, and I will just quote a few things from it. This is proposal, and it's also critiqued by Americans, and it's not a perfect document by any means, but here's one of the lines. Freedom of conscience is one of the basic constitutional rights of citizens of the USSR, secured effectively by Soviet legislation. Flat out. This law is going to guarantee citizens the right to determine voluntarily and independently their relationship to religion, and in accordance with this belief, the unimpeded performance of religious practices, both individually and together with others, as well as social justice and equality, the defense of the rights and interests of citizens, and so on. Another provision. There's a number of articles, and this is Article 3. Every citizen shall have the right freely and independently to determine his relationship to religion, individually or together with others, to profess any religion or none, and to express and circulate religious or atheistic beliefs. Parents or persons serving in their stead shall have the right to secure the religious and moral upbringing. This is unbelievable. Religious and moral upbringing and training of their children in accordance with their own beliefs. I could have stood here and read this 2 years ago and they would have carted me off to the funny farm. No. Religious rites and ceremonies shall be conducted without hindrance in and around houses of worship, in religious institutions, as well as in apartments and houses of citizens, and in cemeteries, hospitals. Well, maybe you get an idea. The issuance of any legislative act limiting freedom of conscience and also the establishment of any kind of preference of one religion over another is forbidden. Sound familiar? First Amendment. The issuance of any legislative act limiting freedom of conscience and also the establishment of any kind of preference of one religion over another is forbidden. Let's see. That's enough to give you a feel for it. Anyway, it's an amazing document. They're going to be debating it, and they're actually looking for input from American scholars to help them improve it. And they've shown them ways in which they can improve it. I mean, I'm convinced that Gorbachev wants to produce this religious freedom. And, of course, if I wanted to relate that to our own First Amendment thing and just make one observation about it, and that is, I buy John Courtney Murray's idea that the no establishment clause, that is, that we're not supposed to establish state religion in these United States of ours, is for the sake of the free exercise clause. That is, that so many people use the First Amendment to say, like we can't have a religion department here at the University of Toledo. Or religion has to be divorced from the public square. Like I was arguing with one professor from another institution, who was trying to argue that religion had no role in the public square. He didn't want churches to have the right to speak out on any political question. He couldn't stand it that the bishops wrote an economics pastoral or a peace pastoral. He just couldn't stand it. Happens to be a Catholic professor. And it was on principled grounds that the church should not be allowed to speak out on these matters. This is a man who holds up economically the free market system. And in my response to him, don't you want a free market of ideas? What happened? When we moved to ideas, and suddenly that we don't have a free market where we can't get our words in, where the churches aren't allowed to speak out. Well, maybe the Soviet process here helps us to, I think, see that religion has a role in the public square, and that the free exercise is a positive thing in our culture, that our culture benefits from religion. It's not just a drag or an opiate, as Mark said, but it can help us move forward. Let's just take a couple minutes for questions, then we're going to go. Chrissy? Well, a very good question, and a very difficult one, I think. I would see it as a dialect. I mean, I don't think the media ever totally creates something like that. It seems to me the media is in dialogue with some other element in the culture as a whole. I mean, let's just take the whole idea of, during the Vietnam War, we were talking about, is my country right or wrong? And love it or leave it. Those are slogans commonly used within the culture. Now, did somebody make those up? No, I don't think so. I mean, that sort of was a line taken, for example, by Lyndon Johnson. I mean, Lyndon Johnson turned against anybody who opposed him. There was when we had the thing for the weekend for Dr. Charles de Benedetti, a great peace activist from our campus, and a group of seminars, and so I happened to hear one speaker who was describing Lyndon Johnson's reactions to friends in the Senate who began to question him. It was Vance Hartke from Indiana. Vance Hartke and Lyndon Johnson were like that. And Hartke wrote him just a simple letter saying, are you sure you got this right on Vietnam? I mean, is escalation the way to do this? Is this the right thing? And Johnson just cut him off. He cut off all his friends who began to oppose him. Well, where did we get my country right or wrong? You know, I mean, in other words, it was in the political air. The media didn't make it up. I mean, sloganeers would come up with a catchphrase, but it's because it's there somehow. I mean, advertising can't do anything if you didn't have corporations who, were interested in making profit and so on. If you didn't have oil companies who were interested in making profit and know that it was wise to make it sound like they were in favor of wildlife, you wouldn't have commercials like that. So it seems to me that the slogans and become interactive with the experience of the country as a whole, including its cultural side, its political side, and its economic side. And then it reinforces, then there's an action. Once you get slogan and you get image, then it feeds back into the perceptions of the people. And you get more people saying, my country wrong. And you get a false notion of patriotism, where patriotism means shut up. You go along with the government, and you lose some virtue of patriotism. It says, well, if you really love the country, then you want it to live up its ideals, and you want it to be as good as it can be, so you would keep it. You'd lose it. So I see them interacting back and forth. And the media then, slogans and images, really affect the consciousness. You produce more people who think that. You look at that with the models of what it means to be a woman in our culture, and how that gets played in magazines, etc.
Strike reports of countries like Poland that is more crime-free. And I'm wondering, an irony in that, just going back to what you said, can people handle that?
No.
Is there anybody speaking in that regard in Russia now that's concerned about that?
There is a definite concern, and it's understandable, isn't it? When anyone's been repressed, a group or individuals, and they get freedom, there's a tendency to go wild with it. I had a scene, I might have shared it in one of the other classes, but I know you didn't hear it, but I was down in a subway late at night, and there was a group of young people gathered there. And they weren't really causing any real trouble. I mean, the subway's clean. You know, they probably were drinking before this, but I didn't see any bottles visible. But the police tried to break them up. And the police came down, a fair number of police, to break them up, and they wouldn't move. And there was a couple of the leaders of the group that started jawing with the police. And the police sent for other policemen. And a big, tough, older policeman came down there. And he finally dispersed them. But even I watched all this, even one of the young people was sort of talking back to him. And I thought, here is freedom. I mean, you know, what is going to happen? They're just getting now... you know, these people are exhilarated by freedom. I mean, a couple of years ago, they're in a paddy wagon. They're gone. You know, they could have never chanced anything like that. And now you begin to see that. They're starting to talk now. They're beginning to have a drug problem. Just the start of that. Their street crime is just starting. In other words, I walked all over the streets of Moscow at night with no fear. Something I'd never do in New York City in like that, but no fears. And but I heard from people after I did that there is just the beginning now of some street crime. Well, I mean, I think it's absolutely predictable what's going to happen. You know, drug scene is going to grow.
But street crime doesn't decrease here. In other words, we just didn't get our freedom. And
Yeah.
I'm just wondering whether, you know, if there's something that we have that keeps the street crime high, and as opposed to
illegal drugs.